In 1972, a U.S. Army Ranger training exercise in the Mark Twain National Forest went catastrophically wrong. What was supposed to be a routine week-long survival course became a nightmare that left 3 men dead and 5 others refusing to speak publicly about what happened. The Army classified the incident as a training accident caused by severe weather and difficult terrain. They sealed the after-action reports and transferred the surviving Rangers to different units within weeks. But one man kept a journal. The squad leader documented everything in a small waterproof notebook that he carried throughout his military career. 50 years later, his daughter found that notebook among his effects after his death. What follows is drawn directly from those pages, written in the shaking hand of a man who survived something that should not exist. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. We deployed from Fort Leonard Wood on October 16, 1972, at 0500 hours. The morning was cold enough to see our breath, and frost covered the vehicles in the motor pool in crystalline patterns that crunched under our boots. 9 of us loaded into the back of a 2.5 truck, weapons wrapped in canvas, rucksacks heavy with minimal supplies. The diesel engine roared to life and we rolled out through the main gate as the first light of dawn broke over the Missouri hills. The mission was straightforward: survive a week in the Mark Twain National Forest with limited rations, evade instructor teams hunting us with dogs and vehicles, and navigate 40 miles of rough terrain to an extraction point. We were all combat veterans, most with tours in Vietnam. We had faced real enemies in real jungles. This felt like a formality, a box to check before the next deployment. We carried M16 rifles with blank ammunition, pistols also loaded with blanks, combat knives, compasses, ponchos, wool blankets, and 3 days of field rations. The rest we would have to forage or do without. That was the point of the exercise. The briefing had been standard. Our captain stood in front of a large topographic map and traced our route with a pointer. Stay away from civilians. Avoid the instructor teams or fail the exercise. Make noise if we encountered bears. Watch for copperheads even though they would be going dormant. The captain was confident and professional. A West Point graduate who had survived his own combat tour and knew how to run a tight operation. He showed us the maps, traced our route with his finger across elevation lines and water sources, and sent us off with the usual warnings about hypothermia and dehydration. What he did not mention, what perhaps he did not know, was that locals had been reporting strange sightings in that forest for months. Large figures moving through trees at night, visible only as dark shapes against darker shadows. Screams that sounded almost human but carried wrong, too deep, too resonant, echoing off bluffs in ways that made livestock panic and dogs refuse to leave porches. Farmers had found livestock killed in ways that made no sense. Necks broken with tremendous force, bodies crushed as if by coils. The sheriff's office had received at least a dozen calls since August from frightened people who had seen things they could not explain. But the Army does not believe in folklore. They believe in maps and mission parameters and controlled conditions. They believe the world operates according to rules that can be understood and mastered through training and technology. That belief would cost 3 men their lives. The truck dropped us at a fire road on the forest's western edge at 0700 hours. The driver gave us a casual salute and drove off, the sound of the engine fading into the distance until we stood in complete silence surrounded by endless trees. The forest pressed in around us, oak and hickory stripped bare by autumn, branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. Fallen leaves covered the ground in thick layers of orange and brown, and the smell of decay hung heavy in the cold air. We checked our weapons one final time, ensured magazines were seated properly, adjusted our rucksack straps to distribute the weight across our shoulders and hips. Then we moved out in tactical formation, maintaining proper intervals, our boots crunching through the leaf litter. The point man led us up a ridgeline, following a compass bearing that would take us east toward our first waypoint. The terrain was challenging but not impossible for men of our training. We moved along ridgetops where possible, staying above the hollows where movement would be harder and visibility more limited. Limestone bluffs rose from deep cuts in the land, gray stone faces that wept water from underground springs. The forest was quiet except for the occasional crow, calling in the distance, and the sound of our own movement through the undergrowth. We covered 8 miles that first day, stopping every hour to check our position against the map and take compass bearings. The squad leader marked our progress in his notebook, noting landmarks and calculating our pace. We saw deer that bounded away through the trees when they caught our scent. We saw turkeys scratching through leaves in a hollow, their heads jerking up alert when we passed above them. Once we saw a black bear, a large male probably weighing 300 pounds, watching us from perhaps 50 yards away. We made noise, talking loudly and clanging our canteen cups against our rifles. The bear watched for another minute, then ambled away through the undergrowth with surprising grace for something so large. That first night, we established camp in a natural depression on the eastern slope of a ridge, a spot that concealed us from casual observation while giving us clear sight lines in 3 directions. We cut branches to form a rough lean-to that would break the wind, though we could not light a fire without giving away our position to the instructor teams. We ate cold rations, beef stew congealed in the can, crackers gone soft in the humidity, coffee packets mixed with cold water that tasted like dirt but contained the caffeine we would need to stay alert. We set up a guard rotation, 2-hour shifts throughout the night. The man on guard would walk a slow circuit around our perimeter, stopping every few minutes to listen to the forest, checking that everyone else was still breathing in their sleep. The temperature dropped into the 30s after sunset, and we huddled in our ponchos trying to conserve body heat. The wool blankets helped but were not enough. We shivered and tried to sleep and waited for dawn. The second day was much like the first. We moved through oak forest, the canopy bare enough that sunlight reached the ground in shafts that illuminated the leaf litter. We maintained our pace, covered our distance, checked our position religiously. The communication specialist tried to raise command at our scheduled check-in time, but the ridges and hollows played hell with radio signals. Static was all we got. We moved on, trusting that the instructor teams would assume we were maintaining radio silence to avoid detection. That second night passed without incident. Cold and uncomfortable but routine. We rotated through guard duty, ate our cold rations, shivered in our blankets. The forest made its normal sounds around us. Branches creaking in the wind, small animals moving through the darkness, an owl hunting somewhere in the hollow below our position. Everything was as it should be. On the 3rd morning, we found the first sign. At a spring where we stopped to refill canteens, there were tracks in the mud beside the water. They looked almost human at first glance, the general shape of a foot with 5 toes. But the size was all wrong. The prints were easily 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, far larger than any human foot. The depth of the impression suggested massive weight, perhaps 300 pounds or more. The stride between prints measured over 6 feet. We stood around those tracks in silence, each man trying to rationalize what he was seeing. Bears walk on hind legs sometimes. Maybe the prints had melted and spread in the sun. Maybe it was someone's idea of a joke. But the tracks continued up the slope in a straight line, each one placed with deliberate precision. Whatever made them had been walking upright with a steady gait. We filled our canteens and moved on. No one spoke much for the next hour. Every man was processing what we had seen, fitting it into the mental framework of known threats. The problem was that it did not fit anywhere. That night, everything changed. The scream came around midnight, cutting through the darkness like a blade drawn across flesh. One moment the forest was quiet, filled only with the soft sounds of men sleeping and the gentle rustle of wind through bare branches. The next moment the sound exploded from the hollow below our position. It started low, almost like a cough or grunt, from deep in a massive chest, then rose in pitch and volume until it became a howl that echoed off the limestone bluffs and reverberated through the trees. The sound was not like anything any of us had heard before, not in these forests and not in the jungles of Vietnam. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds, rising and falling in waves that seemed to vibrate the air itself. Then it cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise had been. The sudden quiet was oppressive, unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We grabbed our weapons and moved to defensive positions without needing orders. Training took over, bodies moving on instinct, honed through combat and endless drills. The man on guard duty stood frozen at the perimeter, his rifle raised toward the darkness of the hollow, his face pale in the moonlight that filtered through the bare branches overhead. The rest of us spread out in a defensive arc, covering different approaches, fingers on triggers even though we knew the blank rounds would do nothing against a real threat. We waited. Minutes stretched into eternity. Every sense was heightened, every small sound amplified. We could hear our own breathing, the pounding of our hearts, the soft creak of leather as someone shifted their grip on a rifle. The temperature had dropped into the low 30s, and our breath came out in visible puffs that hung in the still air. But despite the cold, sweat ran down our backs and soaked into our uniforms. Nothing came. The forest stayed silent, and that silence was perhaps more disturbing than the scream had been. In a healthy forest at night, there should be sound. Insects chirping, small animals moving through leaf litter, owls hunting, the rustle of bats feeding on moths. But now there was nothing. Even the normal night chorus of insects had stopped completely, as if every living thing had gone into hiding. In Vietnam, we had learned that silence meant danger. When the jungle went quiet, it was because something was moving through it that scared everything else into stillness. A tiger, a squad of enemy soldiers, something that belonged at the top of the food chain, something that made prey animals freeze and hope not to be noticed. We posted double guards for the rest of the night, 2 men on watch at all times, shifts reduced to 1 hour because no one could stay focused and alert for longer than that. The men who were supposed to be sleeping lay in their ponchos with weapons beside them, eyes open, staring at the darkness. Every crack of a branch brought us alert. Every rustle in the leaves made us reach for our rifles. Some of the men whispered to each other, trying to rationalize what we had heard. A mountain lion, maybe. They could scream like that. Or a bobcat in heat. Animals made all kinds of strange sounds during mating season, but none of us really believed it. The scream had been too loud, too deep, with a resonant quality that suggested a chest cavity far larger than any mountain lion, and there was something else in it, something that we could not quite articulate, but that set off alarm bells in the primitive parts of our brains that still remembered when humans were prey. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening by degrees from black to deep blue to gray. We had never been so grateful to see sunrise. We broke camp quickly, stuffing our ponchos and blankets into rucksacks with shaking hands, checking our weapons multiple times even though we had checked them throughout the night. No one spoke about the scream directly, but the tension was visible in every movement, every glance at the tree line, every pause to listen for sounds of pursuit. We moved out as soon as there was enough light to navigate safely, abandoning our planned pace in favor of simply putting distance between us and whatever had made that sound. The point man led us along the ridge at a faster clip than before, and no one complained about the pace, even though our legs burned and our lungs ached in the cold morning air. The morning brought us to a stream in a hollow, clear water running over smooth stones with patches of ice forming in the slower eddies near the banks. The map showed this as a reliable water source, fed by springs in the limestone bedrock that ran year-round even in drought. We needed to refill our canteens, conserve what little water we had left. The descent into the hollow was steep, and we had to pick our way carefully down the slope, grabbing saplings and exposed roots to keep from sliding on the loose leaf litter. That was where we found the deer. The carcass lay on the bank about 10 feet from the water's edge, positioned in a small clearing where morning sunlight broke through the canopy. At first glance it looked like any other deer kill, something that happens thousands of times every day in forests across America. Predators hunt, prey dies, the cycle continues, but as we got closer the details began to register, and what we saw made no sense according to any pattern of predation we knew. The deer was a doe, probably weighed around 130 pounds when alive. She had been killed recently within the last few hours based on the fact that the blood was still wet and dark red rather than brown and dried. Steam still rose from the opened body cavity. where the cooler morning air met the residual heat of internal organs. Rigor mortis had not yet set in. The body was still flexible, still warm to the touch, but the manner of death was completely wrong. The deer's head had been twisted a full 180 degrees, rotating until the neck broke with catastrophic force. Cervical vertebrae were not just fractured but shattered, bone fragments protruding through the torn hide in multiple places. The amount of force required to do that was staggering. A deer's neck is thick with muscle and sinew, built to support a head that must stay alert for predators while feeding. To break it with a twisting motion required not just tremendous strength, but also the kind of grip and leverage that suggested hands, not teeth or claws. The body showed no bite marks along the flanks or throat where a mountain lion would attack, no claw marks from gripping or pinning the prey while feeding, no signs of the disembowelment that a bear would inflict, tearing into the soft belly first to access organs. The hide was intact except where the broken vertebrae had punctured through from inside. The deer had simply been killed with overwhelming force and then left there, meat untouched, organs undisturbed. But that was not the worst part. The detail that made our skin crawl and our stomachs turn was the positioning. The deer had been arranged deliberately, placed with conscious intent. It lay on its side with all 4 legs extended and straightened, front legs parallel to each other, back legs parallel to each other. The body was positioned perpendicular to the stream, with the head pointing upstream. This was not how a deer falls when killed. Bodies collapse in the position they die, legs folding, head dropping. They do not arrange themselves in geometric patterns. Someone or something had straightened those legs after death, had positioned the body just so, had taken the time to create a display, a message, a warning written in flesh and bone. Next to the carcass, pressed deep into the soft mud of the stream bank, where water had eroded the soil, was another of those massive footprints. The detail was perfect in the wet earth. We could see the individual toe impressions, 5 of them like a human foot but far too large. We could see the arch unusually high and well-defined. We could see where the heel had pressed deepest, suggesting a walking gait rather than running, weight distribution indicating upright bipedal locomotion. The print was fresh, no more than an hour or 2 old, based on the way water was still seeping into the depression from the saturated ground around it. We stood around that deer in silence. 9 combat veterans who had seen men killed in every way imaginable, who had walked through villages after massacres, who thought we were beyond being shocked by death. But this was different. This violated rules we had not even known we were following. Predators do not waste protein. They do not kill without feeding. They do not arrange corpses in patterns that speak of intelligence and intent. One man crouched beside the print and placed his hand next to it for scale. His hand, average size for an adult male, looked like a child's by comparison. The print was at least 3 times larger in every dimension. Another man knelt by the deer's head and examined the broken neck, touching the protruding bone fragments gently, as if he could somehow make sense of the injury through physical inspection. His hands shook. We could all see them shaking. What could do this? Someone finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What has the strength to break a deer's neck like that? No one answered because no one had an answer that made sense. We had all hunted. We knew how strong deer were, how they could bound through forest and leap over obstacles, how much force it took to bring one down even with a rifle. The idea that something could grab a deer with its bare hands and twist its head around like unscrewing a bottle cap was beyond our comprehension. "We're being followed," someone else said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact that we all understood but had not yet spoken aloud. The squad leader studied the print, then the deer, then the surrounding forest. His face had gone hard, locked into the expression of a man forcing himself to think tactically when every instinct was screaming at him to run. "We alter the route," he said finally. north toward the fire road, 5 miles. We signal for extraction and end this exercise. No one argued. Surviving was more important than completing a training mission. We filled our canteens quickly, hands shaking as we dipped the containers into the cold stream. The water tasted clean, but we hardly noticed. We kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see something watching us from the shadows. We saw nothing, but the feeling of being observed was overwhelming, pressure behind our eyes like someone staring at the backs of our heads. We moved out at double time, abandoning stealth in favor of speed. The tactical formation we had maintained for 2 days dissolved into something more urgent. Men staying closer together, weapons up and ready. We pushed through thick undergrowth that tore at our uniforms and scratched our faces. We scrambled up steep slopes, grabbing exposed roots and rocks for purchase, legs burning with the effort. Our rucksacks felt like they weighed 100 pounds each, straps cutting into our shoulders. But we did not stop to adjust them, we just moved. We covered 3 miles in just under 2 hours, pushing our bodies harder than was wise given the terrain and our limited rations. Our lungs ached in the cold air. Sweat soaked through our uniforms despite the temperature. Our legs trembled with exhaustion, but we kept the pace steady, driven by fear that was becoming harder to control with each passing minute. Around noon, we stopped to rest on a flat section of ridge where young oaks had grown after a fire years before. The trees were thin here, visibility extending perhaps 50 yards in all directions. It was the most open ground we had seen since entering the forest, and we took advantage of it. The squad leader pulled out the radio while the rest of us formed a defensive perimeter, kneeling in a circle facing outward, weapons aimed at the tree line. The communications specialist tried to raise command on the radio, working through all the frequencies we had been assigned, adjusting the antenna position, checking and rechecking the connections. Nothing. Static across every channel. He replaced the battery even though the indicator showed full charge. Still nothing. The equipment was functioning perfectly according to every diagnostic he could run. We simply were not getting through to anyone. Could be the terrain, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. These ridges and hollows create dead zones. We need higher ground. The squad leader pulled out the map and studied it, his finger tracing elevation lines. There was a high point marked about a mile north, Eagle Peak, elevation 1,200 feet. If we could reach it, we would have line of sight to the nearest relay station. We moved to the peak, he said. Get that radio working. This exercise is over. We moved through a section of old-growth forest with massive oaks that blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a green twilight even at midday. The trunks were enormous, 5 or 6 feet in diameter, trees that had been growing for a century or more. The forest floor was relatively clear beneath them, the canopy so thick that little undergrowth could survive. Our boots crunched through leaf litter that was a foot deep in places, layers of leaves from decades of autumns compressed into a soft mat. The point man suddenly raised his fist, the signal to halt. Everyone froze instantly, bodies going still, breathing slowing. He pointed toward a thicket of mountain laurel about 30 yards to our right, the evergreen shrubs forming a dense mass that offered perfect concealment. There was a shape standing in the shadows behind the laurel, partially obscured by the thick vegetation. At first glance, it might have been a tree trunk or a large boulder, just another vertical element in the forest. But as our eyes adjusted and our brains processed what we were seeing, the shape resolved into something that couldn't be dismissed or rationalized away. It was tall, far taller than a man, perhaps 7 or 8 feet. The estimate was difficult because we could not see its feet, could not establish a clear baseline for measurement. But it towered over the laurel bushes that were themselves 6 feet high. The body was massive, broader across the shoulders than any human, covered in dark hair that looked matted and thick, hanging in clumps that suggested it had been wet recently, or perhaps was always that way. The arms hung down past where the knees would be, longer than human proportions, ending in hands that we could not see clearly but that appeared massive even from this distance. The face was the worst part. It was turned toward us, watching us, and we could see the features clearly enough to recognize them as almost human but not quite. The brow was heavy and prominent, creating deep shadows over the eyes. The nose was flat and wide, the nostrils large and flared. The mouth was a straight line that showed no expression, no teeth, no emotion that we could read. But the eyes were fully human, dark and intelligent and fixed directly on us with an awareness that was unmistakable. This thing was thinking, it was evaluating, it was making decisions. We stood frozen in a tableau that felt like it lasted hours, but was probably only seconds. 9 armed men facing one unarmed creature across 30 yards of open forest. By every tactical calculation, we had the advantage. We had weapons, numbers, training, the discipline of soldiers who had survived combat. The creature had nothing but its body and whatever intelligence lived behind those eyes. But we all knew in that moment of frozen time that the tactical calculations meant nothing. Our weapons fired blanks. Our training had not prepared us for this. Our numbers would mean nothing if that thing decided to charge. We were prey pretending to be predators, and the pretense was paper thin. The squad leader slowly brought his rifle up, not aiming directly at the creature but ready to react. The movement was careful, controlled, the motion of a man who did not want to trigger an attack through sudden action. The creature watched him move, its head tilted slightly to one side, the gesture eerily human, as if it was curious about what we would do next. Then it opened its mouth and released a sound that we felt in our chests, more than heard with our ears. The same scream from the previous night, but louder, closer, impossible to mistake for anything natural. The sound started deep, resonating from that massive chest cavity, then rose in pitch and volume until it filled the forest and echoed off the surrounding ridges. It carried threat and warning and rage all mixed together in a vocalization that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the animal parts of our brains that knew what it meant to be hunted. The scream lasted perhaps 5 seconds. When it stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. Not even wind moved through the branches. Then the creature turned with surprising grace for something so large and moved into the forest. It did not run or crash through undergrowth like a panicked animal. It simply stepped behind the laurel thicket and vanished, moving with the kind of controlled movement that spoke of intelligence and intent. Something that large should not have been able to disappear so quickly or so quietly, but it did, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there. We stood paralyzed for a moment longer, then broke. The word run was not spoken, but everyone moved at once, turning and sprinting back the way we had come, abandoning any pretense of tactical movement. We ran through the forest like panicked deer, rifles banging against our sides, rucksacks bouncing on our backs, branches whipping our faces. Behind us we heard sounds of movement. The sounds paralleled our path on both sides, moving through the forest at a pace that matched ours. They were not trying to be quiet. Branches snapped with sharp cracks that carried clearly through the trees. Undergrowth crashed as heavy bodies pushed through it. We heard footfalls, heavy impacts that shook the ground beneath our feet, the steady rhythm of something large moving on 2 legs. Multiple somethings, at least 3, possibly more, coordinating their movements to keep pace with us. They were hurting us. The realization came gradually, piecing together the pattern of sounds. When we veered left, the sounds on that side grew closer, more aggressive, forcing us back to the right. When we tried to angle toward higher ground, the sounds ahead cut us off, driving us back down toward the hollow. They were working together, communicating somehow, coordinating their movements to push us exactly where they wanted us to go. Then they began to vocalize. The screams came from multiple directions, overlapping and echoing off limestone bluffs that turned the forest into an echo chamber. One scream from the right, deep and resonant, an answering call from the left, slightly higher pitched, a third from somewhere ahead cutting off our intended route. The sounds were not random. They had pattern, structure, intent. They were talking to each other, using vocalizations to coordinate their hunt the way wolves or lions do when taking down prey. We were being driven east, away from the fire road we had been trying to reach, back toward the interior of the forest where the terrain grew rougher and more isolated. The squad leader tried to break through their line, angling south down a steep slope into a hollow. The sounds followed, closer now, aggressive barks and screams that made it clear we were not going that direction. We turned back, climbed out of the hollow, continued in the direction they were pushing us. Halfway down another slope, disaster struck. One man's boot caught on a root hidden beneath the leaf litter. His ankle turned with an audible snap that carried clearly in the cold air, the sound of bone breaking distinct and unmistakable. He cried out, a short, sharp sound of pain that he cut off by biting down on his glove. He rolled several feet down the slope before managing to grab a sapling and stop his momentum, coming to rest in an awkward position against a tree. 2 men reached him within seconds, the medic and one other. The medic cut away the bootlaces with his knife and examined the injury with practiced hands, fingers probing gently to assess the damage. The ankle was broken, no question. A compound fracture with bone showing white through the torn skin, blood welling from the wound and soaking into his sock. The joint was already swelling, tissue around the break turning purple and distended. The man's face had gone pale, lips pressed into a thin line as he fought to control the pain. "Can you splint it?" the squad leader asked. Though we all knew the answer, the question was procedure, the kind of thing leaders ask even when they know what the response will be. "I can stabilize it," the medic said, his hands already moving to pull supplies from his medical kit. "But he needs a hospital, and we need to move him carefully or we'll damage it worse. Maybe sever an artery or drive bone fragments into tissue." We did not have time to move him carefully. The sounds were getting closer, converging on our position from 3 sides. We could hear the heavy footfalls now. Not just the breaking of branches, but the actual impact of feet hitting ground, coming from multiple directions. They knew we had stopped. They knew one of us was injured. They were closing in. "We carry him," the squad leader said. 2 men on the casualty. Medic stays with them. Rest of us form security. We move as fast as possible. It was the only option, but it was not fast enough, and we all knew it. The medic did quick work, wrapping the ankle in an elastic bandage from his kit, immobilizing it as best he could without a proper splint. 2 men grabbed the injured man under the arms, one on each side, and lifted him to his feet. He bit down on a stick they gave him, something to clench between his teeth to keep from screaming when the jolts of movement sent fresh agony through his broken ankle. We moved as a group, slower now, hindered by the need to support the injured man. Every few steps they would stumble on the uneven ground, and the jolts would make the injured man's body go rigid with pain. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold. His breathing came in short gasps, but he did not complain, did not ask us to leave him. He just held that stick between his teeth and let us drag him through the forest. The creatures closed in. We caught glimpses of them moving through the trees now, always at the edge of vision, never fully visible. Dark shapes sliding between trunks. There one moment and gone the next. They were staying just out of clear sight, maintaining distance, pacing us. They moved on 2 legs with an upright posture that was definitely not bear-like, definitely not any known animal. The hair covering their bodies ranged from dark brown to almost black. The size varied. The largest looked to be well over 8 feet tall, its head visible above brush that stood 7 feet high. A smaller one, perhaps only 6.5 feet, moved with quicker, more agile steps, darting between trees. There were at least 4 of them, possibly more. It was hard to count when they kept moving, kept disappearing and reappearing in different positions, but 4 was the minimum we could confirm. 4 separate shapes moving in coordination, working together to herd us like wolves working a deer toward a cliff edge. Then one of them stepped into full view ahead of us, blocking our path completely. It emerged from behind a massive oak trunk perhaps 40 yards away, moving with deliberate slowness, making no attempt to hide. This was not a glimpse at the edge of vision. This was full exposure, clear sight, undeniable reality. It was the largest one, the alpha, 8 feet tall at minimum, possibly closer to 9. The body was massive, broader across the shoulders than any human could ever be. It was covered in coarse hair that hung in matted clumps, dark brown or black. The hair was thicker on the shoulders and chest, thinner on the arms and legs where we could see the musculature beneath, slabs of muscle that stood out even through the covering of hair. The arms were too long, hanging down past the knees, ending in hands that looked fully functional. The hands were massive, each one larger than a dinner plate, fingers thick as broom handles. The nails were black and curved, thick and hard. The legs were proportioned for upright walking, feet large and flat. It stood fully upright with perfect posture. This thing walked on two legs as its primary mode of locomotion. The face was too human to dismiss as an animal, but too alien to accept. The brow was heavy and prominent. The nose was flat and wide, the nostrils large and flared. The mouth was a straight line, lips thin. The jaw was massive, muscles visible working beneath the skin, and the eyes were fully human, not human-like. They were human eyes, dark, with white visible around the iris, with clear intelligence looking out. Those eyes tracked our movements, studied our weapons, evaluated our threat level. This thing was thinking, assessing, making tactical decisions. We stopped moving. The two men carrying the injured man set him down carefully. The rest of us formed a rough line, weapons raised, facing the creature across 40 yards. It was the kind of distance where a charging human could close in 4 or 5 seconds. Something this large could probably do it in 3. The squad leader raised his rifle and aimed at the creature's center mass. His voice was loud and firm. "Get back!" he shouted. "Get the fuck back or we will fire!" It was a bluff, and the creature knew it. It stood its ground, watching, making no move to advance or retreat. It was testing us, seeing how we would react. The intelligence in that behavior was terrifying. Then it opened its mouth and screamed at us. The sound was so loud at this range that our ears rang, pressure building inside our skulls. The scream came from deep in that massive chest, resonating, amplified by anatomy designed for projection. It felt like a physical blow. Some of the men staggered back. One dropped to one knee, hands going to his ears. The injured man's eyes went wide and he started hyperventilating. When the scream stopped, the silence was broken by a sound from behind us. Heavy footfalls running. We spun to see another creature charging from the rear. This one slightly smaller, perhaps 7 feet, but moving with frightening speed. It covered ground the way a linebacker charges, head down, arms pumping, massive strides closing the distance in seconds. One man opened fire with his M16, blank rounds making loud pops. Muzzle flash lit the shadows, smoke rolled from the barrel, but the blanks did nothing. The creature did not even slow down. It reached the man who had fired, and one massive hand swept out in a backhand blow that caught him across the chest. The impact lifted him completely off his feet and threw him backward into a tree 10 feet away. He hit the trunk with his back, and we heard things crack inside him. The wet sound of ribs breaking, the harder sound of spine compressing. He hit the ground and lay still, his rifle falling from his hands, his body positioned at an angle that was immediately wrong. Another man did not run. He charged at the creature with his rifle raised like a club, swinging it like a baseball bat. He was driven by instinct to fight rather than flee. He got one good swing in, connecting with the creature's shoulder, with enough force to splinter the wooden stock. The impact should have broken bone. It did nothing. The creature barely registered the blow. It grabbed the rifle with one hand and yanked it from the man's grip as easily as taking a toy from a child. The rifle flew through the air and hit a tree 20 feet away, the metal barrel bending. Then the creature grabbed the man by the throat with one hand and the belt with the other, lifted him off the ground, and simply pulled in opposite directions. We heard his spine crack, heard things tearing inside him, the sound of a body being destroyed from within. The creature held him there for a moment, the man's legs kicking weakly, then dropped the broken body and turned toward the rest of us. We ran. The word was not spoken, but the decision was unanimous and instant. Pure animal terror drove us through the forest, overriding every tactical instinct, every piece of training, every bit of discipline we had spent years developing. We were no longer soldiers. We were prey animals fleeing from predators, driven by the most basic imperative of survival. The man with the broken ankle was dragged between two others, one under each arm, his feet barely touching the ground as they hauled him forward. He had stopped biting the stick, was now openly screaming with every jolt, the pain too overwhelming to contain. But we could not stop, could not slow down, could not give him the careful handling his injury required. Behind us we heard the creatures moving, heard branches breaking and heavy footfalls, heard the screams calling back and forth as they communicated. We burst through undergrowth that tore at our uniforms and raked bloody lines across our faces. We scrambled over fallen logs, splashed through a stream without slowing, climbed a steep bank on the other side with hands clawing at roots and rocks. Our lungs burned. Our legs felt like they were on fire. The injured man's weight was dragging down the two men carrying him, slowing them, slowing all of us because we refused to leave him behind. Then we broke through the tree line onto a logging road, gravel and dirt stretching in both directions, and ahead we saw salvation. A house sat perhaps 200 yards down the road, a small farmhouse with white paint peeling from weathered boards and smoke rising from a brick chimney. Lights glowed in the windows, warm yellow light that spoke of safety and civilization and the normal world where things like what we had just seen did not exist. We ran toward it with the last of our strength, boots pounding on gravel, weapons forgotten, everything abandoned except the need to reach that house. Behind us at the tree line we heard one final scream, louder than all the others, a sound that seemed to shake the air itself. We did not look back, we just ran. The creatures stopped at the tree line. When we finally risked a glance over our shoulders, we saw them standing there in a rough line, 4 of them, watching us flee. The largest one stood in the center, arms hanging at its sides, head tilted slightly as if observing an interesting phenomenon. It opened its mouth and screamed one final time, a sound that carried both rage and warning, a message we understood even without language. This was their territory. We had been allowed to leave. Next time we might not be so lucky. Then they melted back into the forest and disappeared, moving with that same impossible silence, vanishing into shadows as if they had never been there. We reached the house and pounded on the door with fists and rifle butts, not caring about courtesy or protocol, just needing to get inside, to put walls between us and what was out there. The door opened almost immediately. An elderly man stood there, perhaps 70 years old, wearing flannel and denim, his face weathered from decades of outdoor work. He took one look at us, at our torn uniforms and bloody faces and the man being supported between 2 others, and immediately stepped aside. "Get in," he said. "Get inside now." We stumbled through the door into a small living room that smelled of coffee and wood smoke. A fire burned in the fireplace. An elderly woman, presumably the man's wife, appeared from the kitchen and immediately began clearing space, pushing furniture aside, laying out blankets on the floor for the injured man. She moved with the efficient calm of someone who had dealt with emergencies before. Farm accidents, perhaps, the kind of injuries that happen when working with large animals and heavy equipment. The 2 men carrying the injured man laid him down gently on the blankets. He had gone quiet now, his face pale and clammy, eyes unfocused. Shock was setting in. The medic knelt beside him and began checking his vitals, pulse and breathing, pupil response. The ankle was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and shiny, purple spreading up the leg. The elderly man had gone to a phone mounted on the kitchen wall, an old rotary model. He dialed, waited, spoke briefly. "Sheriff's on his way," he announced, and I called the fort. "They're sending people." We stood in that living room, 9 men who had started the day as professional soldiers and had been reduced to something far more primitive. Some leaned against walls, too exhausted to stand unsupported. Others sat on the floor, heads down, breathing hard. One man was crying silently, tears running down his face, his rifle clutched to his chest. The squad leader stood at the window, staring out at the tree line, watching for movement that did not come. "You boys ran into the Momo," the old man said quietly. He had settled into an armchair near the fire, his face grave. "That's what folks around here call them. Missouri monsters. They've been in these woods longer than anyone can remember, longer than there have been people in these parts. Most times they leave folks alone, stay deep in the forest where nobody goes. But sometimes, especially in October when they're fattening up before winter, they get territorial. They don't like humans in their range. Usually they just scare you off with noise and throwing rocks. Sometimes if you push them too far or corner them, they fight back." He looked at each of us in turn. "You boys got lucky. They could have killed all of you easy if they wanted. They were just driving you out, teaching you a lesson. You learn it?" No one answered. What was there to say? We had learned that the world was bigger and stranger than we thought. We had learned that there were things living in American forests that science did not recognize and that the army did not prepare you for. We had learned that being armed and trained and experienced meant nothing against some threats. The sheriff arrived within the hour, a middle-aged man with a belly that hung over his belt and eyes that had seen enough to not be surprised by much. 2 army trucks followed him, canvas-covered deuce-and-a-halfs that parked in the farmhouse's dirt driveway. Officers got out, our captain among them, his face tight with concern and anger. The sheriff and a deputy went back into the forest with 4 soldiers, following our directions, looking for the 2 men we had lost. They returned 2 hours later with body bags. They found the first man where he had fallen. The second man had the same fate, a sight which would give me nightmares since my last day. The official report, when it was finally filed, called it a training accident, a bear attack combined with difficult terrain and poor decision-making under stress. The physical evidence was explained away. The massive footprints were dismissed as bear tracks that had melted and spread. The arranged deer carcass was never mentioned. The witnesses' statements were classified and sealed. We were debriefed individually in a tent set up in the farmhouse yard. The officer who debriefed the squad leader listened to his full account without interruption, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook, his face carefully neutral. When the account was finished, the officer closed his notebook and looked directly at him. "For the official record," he said, his voice flat and bureaucratic, "you and your men were attacked by a bear, a very large, very aggressive black bear that had lost its fear of humans. The bear was likely rabid or injured, which would explain its unusual behavior. Do you understand?" The squad leader understood. He understood that insisting on the truth would end his career, would mark him as unfit for duty, would brand him as someone who saw things that were not there. He understood that the families of the dead men would receive reduced benefits if negligence was determined. He understood that the army needed this to go away quietly, needed it to become just another training accident in a war that was producing them regularly. "It was a bear, sir," he said. The same conversation happened 8 more times that day with each surviving member of the squad. Some resisted at first, insisted on telling the truth, demanded that their accounts be taken seriously, but in the end, they all agreed. It was a bear, a very large, very aggressive bear. We were all transferred to different units within 2 weeks, scattered to different posts across the country and around the world. The army made sure we never served together again, never had the opportunity to compare notes or build a narrative that contradicted the official story. The man with the broken ankle received a medical discharge after his ankle healed poorly, leaving him with a permanent limp. The rest of us completed our service and eventually retired, carrying what we had seen as private burdens that we shared with no one. Years passed. We completed our service and retired. Most of us never spoke about that week to anyone. But one man kept his journal, wrote everything down while it was fresh, not to prove anything to anyone but for himself, so that when he woke from nightmares he could look at those pages and know he had not imagined it. Now that journal has been found and the truth can be told. There are things in the American wilderness that we do not understand and cannot control. Things that have learned to hide from us, that move through forests with intelligence and purpose. They were here before we arrived and will be here long after we are gone. If you go into the deep woods, pay attention to the warnings, respect the markers, and if you see tracks that are too large, if you hear screams that sound wrong, If you feel eyes watching from the shadows, leave immediately. Do not wait to see what emerges. Some things are better left alone. Some territories are not meant for human intrusion. For more interesting stories like this, consider subscribing.